Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, April 9th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story high-rise that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, 2001. Before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which do occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You just submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. You can just go under continuing education and select live webinars, and the box will be right there on that page. It's the easiest way to get your question in. I'll also be looking on Facebook and on YouTube for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard's going to be covering today. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And guess what? You can see Andy every week. He has a new 9/11 Freefall episode. That's our AE 9/11 Truth radio show. Does an awesome job. If you want to learn more about Leroy Halsey's World Trade Center 7 study, for instance, look there. Well, just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get into it. How many of you actually knew about World Trade Center Building 7? Most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history outside the Twin Towers. It was the worst. 47 stories. 610 feet tall. This would be the tallest building in most of our states. It was part of the World Trade Center complex. Now, this building was not hit by an airplane, so it's an extremely important case study in the collapse of a tall steel frame building, because it was the third one to collapse on 9/11, as we mentioned, about 7 hours after the Twin Towers collapsed. Take a look. Let's see what's going on here. The east penthouse collapses first on the upper left, followed by 6.5 seconds later, the entire global collapse of this building. So if you're dumbfounded, join the club, because here is the official story of this building's collapse from Shyam Sunder of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires? Well, okay. This hasn't happened before, but let's look at these fires. As you can see by the photographs and videos, these are the worst fires that we have photographs and videos of in this building. There's few, they're relatively small, and they're scattered throughout the building on several different floors. At 2:30, they're on the east side of the 12th floor here, and moving at about 3 o'clock over toward the west. This is important because on the east side, the near column 79, the focus of the initiation of collapse on the part of NIST, they say these fires were raging and thus caused the steel to respond, we'll say for now. And then they tried to produce a series of fire simulations, which at about 2 o'clock on the south side, those fires started and moved over. By 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, they're hovering in and around column 79 for over an hour, which they admit is impossible. But they're nevertheless, this is something they maintain, even though they also suggest that fires couldn't persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. So that completely pulls the rug out from underneath their theory, as does the photographs, which show that there were no fires for the last hour and a half of this building's life on those floors, 12 and 13. Their focus of the initiation of collapse. So we at AE 911 Truth have performed our own, more consistent with the evidence, simulation, which shows the fires at about 2 o'clock on the south side, moving by 3 o'clock and gone, burned out in the area around column 79, having moved over toward the east, which is consistent with the photographs that you see here, and not consistent with the NIST fire simulation on the right. So let's go back to Shyam Sunder and get some more clarification here.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So thermal expansion would have required fires present during the collapse and immediately prior to it, which is why they show their false, provably false fire simulation. So let's move on.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, so let's take a look at this theory and see how it works. What they're saying is that these long span beams heated up in this fire immediately prior to its collapse, thermally expanding, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column 79, which causes this floor 13 to fall on 12, 12 on 11, 11 on 10, and so on for 9 floors, causing the whole east side of this building to collapse, as you saw in the video of their computer model. And then that instability travels laterally across this building in less than 6 seconds when global collapse ensues. Now, there's a number of problems, as you can imagine, with this. Let's just start with the fireproofing, which is halfway under construction here, which would have kept any fire from causing thermal expansion of this steel, because that's its job, to keep the steel from getting hot. Not to mention that the fire, as we already discussed, wasn't even in this area at that time. But let's say it was. And let's say this steel could have expanded. Well, it couldn't have pushed this girder off of its seat on this column, because there's 30 shear studs, according to the Frankel shop drawings, tying that girder to the concrete slab up above. It couldn't have been moved anywhere off this column 79. But let's say that those weren't there, as NIST claims, actually. Could this girder have moved off of the seat? Well, it would have had to have been pushed 12 inches off this seat. But NIST says no, it only had to be pushed halfway off the seat, just where the web, the vertical component of this girder, was pushed off the edge of the seat, and then the flange folded. Well, how do they get away with that? They ignore these 3/4 inch thick steel stiffeners, which would have supported that flange from folding as it was moving off of its seat. In other words, the girder had to have been moved 12 inches in order to fall. But let's say that wasn't the case, and this girder did get pushed off of its seat. Could this floor 13 have fallen onto 12? Well, we need to ask ourselves, we'll come back to that question because that's absolutely key. So there's not enough force here, as we'll find, to break the girder, the massive girders that are framed into this floor below. It would have required 10 times the amount of force that's available, even if all three of these girders gave way and could have fallen that low. But let's say that happened, and there's a succession of floor failures underneath. If we had the interior cascading failure, as NIST suggests, there would have been massive deformation of the exterior perimeter structural steel system. It would have crumpled up like a beer can in this moment-resisting steel frame structure. These beams and girders are rigidly welded to the exterior perimeter structure, obviously. So as they were pulling in, it would have pulled in the whole structure. But that's not what we saw in the video. Well, here's their animation in which they prove, or try to, their collapse theory.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
We'll see about that in a moment. But look, you have 400 structural steel connections failing every second on the east side. Well, let's just compare it. Let's just compare it. Okay. Be that way. Let's compare it with the actual video on the left, the animation on the right. The east penthouse comes down, but look, there's no breaking of windows and granite panels, which would have happened if all this damage was happening. And it begins to tip over. So they stop it after 2 seconds, and it never achieves free fall, which, as we'll see, the video of the collapse does prove. So we have some serious problems here. Show you once again. It doesn't match quite well at all, as NIST claims. They had 7 years to produce a video that matched, and they still couldn't do it. Here's a full screen view. 400 structural steel connections failing every second in order for this collapse to happen the way they show. But something else is going on in the video, right? Okay, so we use a scientific method at AE 911 Truth. That's what we're going to do today. We have a question. How did the building come down? What caused it to collapse? We do background research. How have other buildings collapsed on this order? We construct a hypothesis, make predictions. Fire, that's a reasonable assumption, maybe. Not that it's ever happened before, but let's look at it. Controlled demolition, well, we'll examine that hypothesis today too. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions. If this were true, what else would be true, and so on. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We don't hide the computer input data from architects and engineers around the country and around the world like NIST did, because we did ask them under the Freedom of Information request to produce that input data. Because, you know, if this building came down, then it would be really important for us to know why and to have peer-reviewed analysis about how it came down, because there's hundreds of similarly designed buildings. So we want that information. And what do they respond with? We can't release that information to you. Why? It might jeopardize public safety. That's the actual reason they gave. Wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineer who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? It's a huge problem for them. When the hypothesis is not corroborated, as I suspect you'll agree with us today, it is not, of fire, we go back, right? Construct a new hypothesis until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So walk with us today on this journey as we start doing background research. One of those early steps. How are other buildings destroyed? Well, fire is certainly a destructive force. It's never destroyed a high-rise before 9/11, but say in a wood frame building, it's an organic, chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so and moves on looking for fresh new combustibles. That's what, so if a building's going to fall due to fire, it's generally going to fall over because it's a chaotic process. All the columns aren't destroyed at once when there's a fire. So there's a law of entropy, chaos, increasing disorder. Now, there have been steel frame buildings that have been set on fire on purpose to see what would happen. In 1995, an 8-story building was built just for this purpose. An incredible quantity of fuel was put into it, as you see here on the left, to try to achieve 2,000-degree fires in this building, which had some fireproofed beams and some unfireproofed steel beams. To compare the difference, let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Of course, we're referring here to 9/11 when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse ostensibly due to fire. Well, what did they find? This is an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Even the beams that were not fireproofed, we don't have failure at the connections. That's the strongest part. And the beams simply sag. They don't fail. And that's what's shown in hundreds, well, almost 100 cases of major fires in skyscrapers. Let's take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. One firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So, no collapses of steel frame skyscrapers. Have no complete collapse before 9/11. So what happened? Let's look at buildings that have collapsed. In this case, due to natural causes, earthquakes in this case. We have what's recognizable after the collapse of a building. Its parts are at least semi-intact. The columns and beams are not all severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Let's look at some buildings that exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds in these buildings that were destroyed by explosives. There's a pulverized building materials, an expanding, incredibly hot cloud of pyroclastic-like material. That term comes from a volcano, with cauliflower-shaped plumes that are expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat from the chemical reactions in the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now let's see how explosions can be very effectively harnessed to bring down high rises, because indeed this is the method that most all of them are brought down with, because we have half a dozen companies that specialize in this. It's a science. This doesn't happen to buildings by fire. They have to place thousands of shaped cutter charges against the columns and the beams, precise locations in the building, and then set them off, synchronized floor by floor, to bring them down how they want. So there's a typical set of features associated with these, and they include a sudden onset of destruction, usually near the base of the structure, not always though, and result in a straight down symmetrical collapse, if that's what they want to do, into the building's footprint. Feature number 3, that happens because there's a patterned removal of these column supports, which results in feature number 4, a free fall acceleration quite often, or near free fall, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, but that resistance is removed, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. So you can load it up on trucks without having to do further demolition. With limited damage to adjacent structures, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. Broken up concrete floors, of course, you don't want to have to go back into the building and jackhammer floors, so they, to some level, break up that concrete, sometimes pulverizing it to small chunks. And feature number 9, explosive charges are then visible at many of the floors. And feature number 10 is chemical evidence left behind in the aftermath. If you have these features, guess what? You have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create any of these features, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence like government documentation, that can be very helpful in determining what was a controlled demolition. And foreknowledge, because you don't just bring a building down in an afternoon. It takes months so people know about it. You have to get permits, typically. And experts agreeing, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. So with this in mind, what we want to do today is apply that body of proof to Building 7 and see if it was a controlled demolition or not. Okay, let's start with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? So you'll see the building is standing still, and all of a sudden, things start to happen here real fast. Listen to Dan Rather.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by world-class dynamite to knock it down.
What? Well, we've never heard that from Dan Rather since that time. In fact, we haven't seen, with 2 exceptions on mainstream TV, the third worst structural failure shown on the video of it. Why? It's like it wants to be forgotten. We never forget the Twin Towers collapse, but this one, it wants to be forgotten somehow. Again, most architects and engineers, we go to conferences all around the country. They're completely unaware. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's take a look here from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Interesting. Look at the west penthouse. And the screen wall. They actually collapse a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that mean? That means that the core columns underneath those penthouse structures have been removed, basically. However that happens, their support was removed instantly. All 24 core columns in this case. How does that happen? Didn't NIST say that the instability started on the east, which is the left side in this case, and that the instability traveled across the building laterally from east to west in about 6 seconds? Yes, that was the claim, but that's not what the collapse of these rooftop structures reveals. The east penthouse collapsed 6 seconds earlier, all at once. But here, over the core columns, the entire penthouse and screen wall are collapsing at once, indicating a global failure of the columns directly beneath them. And it right into its own footprint. So this is definitely symmetrical. It's a haystack pile. So the center of that pile is in the center of the footprint. Maybe some aren't quite convinced yet. Let's take a look with building 7 on the left and a series of controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever. Shouldn't it have been the first hypothesis to be examined? But no, it was relegated to a frequently asked question posted on NIST's website years later. And yet these small, random fires are said to have brought this building down symmetrically. Let's look at the symmetry. I mean, how do you bring a building down symmetrically? You have to remove all 24 core columns within a fraction of a second. Otherwise, the building will begin to tip over. And then follow that with the perimeter columns at least a second later. Does fire have that precision? these fires. You really have to think about this. And this one too. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to David Chandler, physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Wait, it fell through its own structure with zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Well, NIST finally admits that it did come down at free fall after denying it for many years. They were publicly embarrassed into admitting it because AE 9/11 Truth members showed up at the conference and said, hey, this is easily measurable. How can you say it didn't come down at free fall? So their final report includes such an admission, but it does not include the implications of the free fall, i.e. what happened to the structure that was 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to support this structure, such that all of it somehow was removed all at once so it could come down as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. With the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. This is a 47-story moment resisting steel frame structure where the columns and beams are rigidly welded to each other. But it falls into a pile like a house of cards. That makes no sense. Buildings that fall due to natural causes don't have their columns and beams severed one from another. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Yeah, pretty limited. There's some damage, but the center of this building pile is in the center of the building's footprint. Do we have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Let's listen to the official story from Shyam Sunder first. NIST was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. He's the project leader.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
Interesting. So, oops, let's go back over here. So what do witnesses say? Listen to this witness who was nearby.
We were walking the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was what looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. And it was horrifying. Then about a second later, the bottom floor caved out. And the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Interesting. A sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. What did this witness, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, have to say.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Interesting. And this witness.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this witness, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, was in the building, having gone back into the building after it was evacuated, which was after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. And this is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then when we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know, so the sound? Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs and made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, the police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs? Bombs like this heard on the late morning of 9/11 by the fire department?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, you want to call your mother or something?
We're told, well, these are the sound of one floor hitting another, but obviously this is an isolated explosion. And such explosions were actually picked up by the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Here's a 0.6 magnitude event near the time of the collapse. And the official narrative says this was produced by the collapse. But let's look at this. Gosh, because the collapse occurs at the signal occurs at 5:20 in the afternoon and 42 seconds. And the start of the building collapse doesn't happen, though, for 10 seconds later. So how does NIST explain this discrepancy if the seismic waves were produced by the collapse? Well, they say a seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from inside the collapse. Well, interesting. If that were true, we have a big problem, because what we saw earlier, was that the interior of this building didn't collapse it before a half a second prior to the overall collapse of the building. We saw that on the videos. So that's fascinating, because the penthouse collapses a half a second earlier. So it couldn't have been the interior of the building, because that was holding up the penthouse. So Andre Rousseau, geophysics expert of 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology, says, gosh, the peak signal occurs at 5:20 and 42. The start of the collapse happens 10 seconds later. And so, but wait, look at the penthouse up above. It collapses just half a second prior to the collapse. So nothing's collapsing inside the building before that. Otherwise, we also would have seen massive breaking up of windows and granite panels. So that is disproven also by his investigation, Andre Rousseau, in 2012. The bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. Well, also, if we turn to the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation, the authority throughout this country for these kinds of investigations, it says, look for the large volume of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, this is exactly what we have racing away from the collapse of Building 7 in every direction at 35 miles per hour. These rapidly expanding plumes of cauliflower-shaped, indicating an incredible heat source, a whole lot more heat than we have available in fires such as these. Those fires were probably extinguished immediately during the collapse. So where's that heat coming from? It's got to be coming from an incredible source, something on the order of this, perhaps. We'll be looking at that now as we look at the evidence for that heat. Here, shown by the NASA Air Flight's infrared sensitive cameras with a thermal map indicating 1,340 degree Fahrenheit temperatures on the surface of Building 7 after its collapse. Well, wait a minute. There's no fire on the surface. So how are we getting 1,300 degree temperatures on the surface? Well, it surely must be something much hotter way down in the pile, in the aftermath, that's radiating up, and by the time it cools, it's cooled down to 1,340 degrees. We'll be looking for that today. But let's listen to Abulhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer professor from UC Berkeley, who says he saw melting of girders at the World Trade Center, like these girders, this piece of steel from World Trade Center 7. They'd never seen anything like this before. Fire doesn't do this to steel, even the hottest office fires. Not even jet fuel, by the way. And remember, no plane hit this building. And the FEMA report, Jonathan Barnett cites steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. The New York Times documents this, but the problem is it takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. So how could steel have been evaporated when fires only get to be a sixth or a fifth or a fourth, 25% of these temperatures typically, especially those fires that you've been looking at in this building? Well, FEMA, the first agency to do a report on this building's collapse, finds in this metallurgical examination in Appendix C, in the Building Performance Assessment Report of May 2002, something fascinating. They find, this is interesting, they find silver dollar size holes. So I'm able to move the slides on my presenter, but not here. We're sorry something went wrong, and that might make PowerPoint unstable, I'll say. So what we're going to do is start that. Oh, interesting. We can't even start the slideshow over. I haven't seen that happen before. What we're going to do here is have Andy, while I have to concentrate on getting this fixed for you. Andy, would you come online and help us out with some answers as to why this steel is so puzzling and what happened to it?
Sure. And so we're talking about Appendix C here, and this is a piece of steel that has a Swiss cheese appearance. Of course, NIST didn't really want to pay attention to this when they did their own analysis and threw the FEMA report out. Now, what does the Swiss cheese appearance mean? All right, that takes about 4,000 degree temperatures to come to this final conclusion here of what happened to the steel. Now, they describe in Appendix C that there was a Swiss cheese appearance and that there was basically evaporation of the steel. Now, think about that. One of the most common memes used out there when people describe 9/11 truth is jet fuel cannot melt steel. And it's become sort of a joke, but it doesn't change the fact that this is true. So how do we come to these temperatures inside the World Trade Center? Of course, NIST completely ignores this. They deny the existence of melted steel despite all of the videos of first responders, politicians, news people talking about it there, pictures of it at the scene.
In fact, thanks, Andy, and they say never before observed in building fires eutectic reactions, which cause intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, as Andy mentioned. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation. Liquid iron. What is liquid iron? That's molten iron. Of course, we're talking 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to create molten iron. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. The sulfur is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST. In fact, they threw this out, this whole metallurgical examination, from their report when they took over from FEMA in 2002, claiming that they didn't have any steel recovered from World Trade Center 7 to test. Again and again and again and again, they say no steel was recovered. Well, wait a minute. What's this? This is steel that was recovered by NIST's co-project leader, John Gross, who provided the very coupon, they call it, for Professor Sisson to examine, in which he found these Swiss cheese appearance and hot sulfur corrosion attack. Gross's shadow is all over the evidence in this case. So what can account for it? The fires are maybe 1,200 degrees at the hottest. NIST claims actually 1,800 degrees without any evidence to support that. Jet fuel, by the way, which wasn't a factor in this building's collapse, and building products are hydrocarbons. They only burn up to 1,400 degrees maximum. Yet steel had definitely melted during this, as you could see, pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavators. By its color, molten metals, we can tell its temperature. That's just the physics of steel, and molten steel. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees here with white hot liquid pouring out of the bottom of this material. So what caused it to melt? Well, let's look and see if there's any forensic evidence of things that could do that. For instance, thermite. There's a possibility. Could that have happened? Well, let's find out what thermite is anyway.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Interesting. Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the extreme heat producing 4,000 degree temperatures. It would explain the elemental iron, as you will see, which is found throughout the World Trade Center dust. Not melted steel, but actual elemental iron. We haven't used iron in steel skyscrapers, by the way, for 100 years or so. So And it would also explain the presence of the sulfur, which was unexplainable by NIST. So sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Well, let's go back to NFPA 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, which says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. When this claims, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. A year later, they write, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. Others looked for it. You can't find what you won't look for. I mean, and others did. Stephen Jones is one of them, a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. He does an analysis on some of the slag sent to him from this sculpture in Manitoba by the sculptor. And looking at this piece of steel, first of all, he finds, gosh, this is not what you'd expect to see from the oxyacetylene torches that were available at the site, which cut cleanly through materials, as you see here. Extremely hot, directed, focused torches don't do this, leaving all this slag behind, and nor this. So he gets real curious and analyzes the slag and finds what? He finds iron, elemental iron. Remember, steel, this is not steel. This is actual elemental iron. There's iron in steel, of course, but this is not that because it has manganese also. It has sulfur and it has aluminum. Aluminum and iron, as you remember, are the key ingredients of thermite found. That's what thermite's made out of iron oxide particles, which is basically rust, and aluminum particles. So let's see what the U.S. Geological Survey finds in their extensive analysis of the dust in their particle atlas of 2005. All the dust samples contain iron microspheres. Well, what are iron microspheres doing in all the World Trade Center dust? They're naked to the human eye. They're almost naked. Some of them are actually a 16th of an inch large. There's billions of them. They don't speculate where they come from, but they document that up to 6% of some of these samples are iron spheres. Well, this is fascinating. It amounts to about 4 tons of material by how much there are in these samples you can extrapolate. And this is 150 times the background value of iron particles, as you see on the left here. That's found sometimes in common office building dust, along with a lot of other stuff. But these are spherical. Interesting. And there's 150 times more, plentiful. So where do they come from? Well, RJ Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm, does analysis also. They find that they're formed during the event, not before, by the welders and construction, not after, by the iron workers, but during, and they're evenly spread. Well, there's more closer to the building and some and less in faraway places found, like on the Brooklyn Bridge. They're so abundant that they're used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from office building dust. This is the key signature component, and yet they don't even know where they came from. They don't speculate. Well, let's look at a thermite experiment, see what happens in a small controlled experiment like this. You see thousands of sparks, but they're not really sparks. They're iron microspheres, which are issued, as you saw, from thermite. And they cool and fall in spheres. Why? Because the surface tension of an aerosolized liquid forms itself into a sphere. Just like raindrops. Could this be what's explaining could possibly explain the toasting of the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center in this high heat event? What else could explain this that's rational? You can make thermite cutter charges in your own backyard, like John Cole, civil engineer, did. You can have a lot of fun and cut pretty cleanly through columns and beams. But there's much more efficient devices that you can buy. They've been patented prior to 9/11. They issue molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel and much more efficiently. Why wouldn't the perpetrators of a controlled demolition of the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers use standard high energy explosives like C4 and RDX? Well, those require very loud bangs and very bright flashes. That's what they provide in their audio and visual signatures. Well, you wouldn't want that, right? If this is a deceptive controlled demolition. There are devices, in fact, whose casings are made of consolidated thermite. So the entire casing is burned up, leaving nothing but a pool of iron, which we've seen plenty of evidence for. Well, not only that, but is there any residue of unignited thermite? That being the residue of ignited thermite. A small team of scientists looked for residue of unignited thermite, led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen. 7 samples collected independently, one on the on-ramp to the Brooklyn Bridge, far, far away from the World Trade Center, relatively, for this dust cloud. Some of them right across from the South Tower, like this apartment of Jeanette McKinley. She was an artist. Her windows blew in. And her whole apartment, she was absolutely terrified. It was catastrophic for her. She collected this dust. She was an artist. It was part of her healing. Unfortunately, it proved to be very disastrous for her. She succumbed to brain cancer 6 years or so later. So her sample is one of these. They all, though, contain these dual-layered red-gray chips. Red on one side, gray on the other. They get real curious because they're attracted to a magnet. So Stephen Jones initially, and then the rest of the team analyzed these. They find that the red layer has properties, characteristics through X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis. They find what? Iron and aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, in the red layer. And carbon, oxygen, silica. They get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times in the red layer, and determine that these are nanoparticles, 1,000 times smaller than the human hair, of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets, set in a bed of carbon material, organic material, including oxygen, silica, carbon. That's the material that is responsible for the expansion, rapid expansion in high energy explosives like C4 and RDX used in traditional controlled demolition. So here we have an incendiary thermite intermixed and engineered along in this matrix of organic material to become more engineered to become more explosive. At 420 degrees centigrade, about 758 Fahrenheit, they, in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, these chips ignite, producing much more energy, indicating their exothermic materials. Well, it's an exothermic reaction with active thermitic materials, which is fascinating because when they do that, they produce spheres, as you see on the upper left, iron microspheres. with the same chemical signature as the iron microspheres produced from the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those iron microspheres came from. It's not a mystery at all, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here, which is fascinating because this is now an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law as evidence to bring the real perpetrators to justice. Because this is very, very sophisticated material. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. And who had access to place this in the World Trade Center towers? So there are all kinds of very good questions that come up here as a result. And this peer-reviewed 25-page paper concludes that the red layer of the red-gray chips are unreacted thermitic material which incorporate nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material found in all the World Trade Center dust samples. It shouldn't be there, obviously. So what we've looked at today with features 1 through 10 of characteristic, mostly uncharacteristic controlled demolition, at least destruction, direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features. And fire caused less robust structures to collapse. They do so asymmetrically, gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. So one reason fire hasn't brought down a skyscraper is because of the steel. It's so dense, it conducts that heat away from the source, even when there's no fireproofing. It distributes that heat. So it never achieves a 1200 degree temperature, steel temperature, at which it can lose half its strength and begin to sag. Another reason is to keep that from happening, we fireproof these steel. They never get hot enough to expand, as NIST claims. We put 2 and 3 hour fire protection on that steel. What does that mean? That means it's 4 to 6 times the protection we need to keep a fire from being a problem. Even as NIST admits, again, 20 to 30 minutes is all the fuel there is in an office building, modern office building, to burn. It moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So this fire protection is normally all you need. But to keep that from ever being a problem, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings. We keep the tenants from bringing in large amounts of fuel. You know, they're just desks and chairs and paper is all. And we make the buildings, the builders build these buildings out of non-combustible materials. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as the FEMA and NIST reports, let's just look into those reports. We have FEMA 2002, limited funding, $600,000, but their efforts were quite hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints of the buildings. They described the access to the site as being like a guided tour. They couldn't get out of their ATVs. They couldn't get appeal to the public for photographs and videos. This is well documented in the New York Times. In 2008, after NIST took over that investigation and eliminating, once again, Appendix C, the metallurgical examination from the report, they started their report with the conclusion that fires caused the buildings to collapse. This was not an open-ended investigation to determine what caused the collapse. They already knew, or claimed they knew, what caused the collapse. They admit early on, truthfully, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, we have in easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, the massive removal of the steel at 400 truckloads a day, effectively scrubbing the crime scene, put on barges sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper investigation. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. What do the experts say about this, by the way? At least those experts who don't have political or financial obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether this is a controlled demolition or not. How about Danny Jowenko, 27-year controlled demolition expert?
In Europe. What did he say? Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten. Er is nasprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics, Earthquake Engineering, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was, with great probability, professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 911 Truth demanding a new investigation. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. And that's why we have a 4-year, $300,000 study by the University of Alaska, Professor Leroy Holsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, performing an analysis that was paid for by thousands of supporters of AE 911 Truth. One of which approached Professor Halsey saying that, gosh, you know, we don't have steel frame buildings falling due to fire. Can you look at this? And he says, okay, well, let's examine the problem here. We got to ensure that public safety is paramount and upheld. We got to understand the failure mechanism. So they examine the response to the fire loads. They rule out scenarios that wouldn't cause the collapse. They identify the type of failures and locations that could have caused or contributed to the observed collapse. They use the same material properties that were used by NIST, so they could compare apples to apples. And they use very sophisticated computer programs to simulate local structural response to the fire loading for the floors that NIST was concerned about, floors 13 and below, examine the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis, and then simulate numerous failure scenarios that might have led to the total collapse, as we observed, and as you observed. So the analysis was put into AutoCAD and then Abacus and SAP 2000, traditional, very sophisticated structural engineering, finite element analysis. And they look at all of the features here, and they come up with very different conclusions from NIST, finding, for instance, that there are serious omissions on the part of NIST with structural elements of the building in order to get it to collapse. So their conclusions with regard to the first approach is that NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. They were flexible, not stiff. So the movement was not from the movements were from the west toward the east. In other words, the exterior wall bowed out. And they found that the connections on several beams were not broken as NIST claim, the shear connections of the shear studs. And they found that NIST omitted the shear studs on girder A2001. They found in approach 3 that the columns did not fail at the lower floors of the building as asserted by NIST. That if they did fail, they wouldn't have caused the collapse of the building. And it would tip over. It wouldn't go straight down, is what I meant. As you see here, they take out these 3 columns, it overloads the exterior columns, and the building begins to tip over. Well, how do you get the building to fall as seen in the video symmetrically? Well, the collapse of this building, they claim, the university finds, was a global failure, not a progressive collapse, as NIST claims, involving the sequential failure of columns, but all at once. As you see here in their final collapse, they find that the penthouse collapse was an independent event, that the collapse of these, the overall collapse of the buildings was a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns, not by thermal expansion. The temperatures weren't hot enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. So something else happened to these columns where they're all taken out over a period of 8 stories, all the columns virtually at once. And that results in a computer model that you see that directly mimics the actual behavior observed in the video of the collapse, not as NIST on the right, an agency of the US government, shows at all in their computer model. So we move to what else could have caused this building's collapse. How do you get that? Well, controlled demolition is observed, but that would mean we'd have foreknowledge of the destruction, as this engineer predicts, because he's asked, well, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? Chief Hayden asked him, and the guy says, well, you have about 5 hours. Well, for the first time in history, an engineer is predicting the collapse of a building by fire, when a fire's never brought down a skyscraper whatsoever. This prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. And yet they won't give us the name of this engineer. Well, how about these construction workers? Can we have their name? They're walking away from building 7. They hear an explosion behind them. They look back at the building, then they look straight into the CNN camera and say this. The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know that? The building's got a few small scattered fires in it. What's going on here? And what about Kevin McPadden? We heard his witnessing of explosions earlier. Now we're going to hear what he said prior to that witnessing of explosions, because he and others are held back about 6 blocks behind the yellow tape, caution tape that was put up. People were moved back because they were expecting this building to come down, somehow expecting it, saying that it had structural damage. Well, what is Kevin McPadden here? He's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker. Let's listen.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do buildings come down due to fires? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's really going on here? What about the BBC announcing the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened?
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. might have heard a few moments ago was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attack. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. We have does this make them psychic? Because they apologize for this premature announcement citing the confusing events of the day. Does that make them psychic? What's going on here? In fact, CNN's not to be outdone. They announced the collapse of a 50-story building at 11:07 that morning. Listen to Alan Dodds-Frank.
In New York, Alan Dodds-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
And just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Blaine Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It's like a forest fire roaring down a canyon.
There was no other building that collapsed besides the Twin Towers. There were some damaged buildings, but they didn't collapse, let alone a 50-story building, which is about the height of the 47-story Building 7. Had this building come down at that time, which was about 15 minutes after the tower went down, it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the towers went down. We wouldn't have video of it today. Was it supposed to go down at that time? Were those mysterious construction workers fixing a dud that went down that didn't go off? We'll leave that in your hands, but we wouldn't have record of it today if it did. Let's go to the owner of World Trade Center, Larry Silverstein, who secured the World Trade Center buildings in addition to Building 7, which he had developed in the 80s. He secured them just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, put massive terrorist insurance on it. And we'll get to those stories in next week and the week after in part 2 and 3 of this 3-part series. But here he is, interviewed a year later on PBS, talking about his recollection of the collapse of this Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What? Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it? They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse? Well, he claims, gosh, I meant the firefighters. Pull the firefighters out of the building. That's what I meant. Well, the firefighters weren't fighting the fire in the building. They were told not to fight the fire in the building. The decision was made early on not to attempt to fight the fires in the building. No firefighting operations in World Trade Center 7. We're told again and again, so he must have meant something else. Well, pull it is a term used by the controlled demolition industry. But which of the two hypotheses makes the most sense after having seen the evidence? Did the building come down due to fire, as according to NIST, the official government narrative, or did it come down by controlled demolition? We leave that question with you. What we believe we've shown is 10 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition today. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives, not evidence of destruction by fire. with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. And we leave that proof in your hands as we go to answer some of your questions. How do people submit questions, Andy?
Okay, you can submit them now in the same input form we were talking about, which was at ae911truth.org. Go under continuing education and then hit the live webinars button. And we're going to do our best to answer them. We've got a lot of them. Are you ready for the questions now, Richard?
Yeah, let's do questions. Wait, we're not ready yet, actually. Let me show people first how to subscribe, because there's some important announcements I want to make first, if that's okay, Andy. We want people to know what's going on, the latest evidence we have, the latest progress toward a real investigation. So just put your name and email in our subscribe option, which is available on the right side on our website, and get informed. Also, look at the evidence section. We have videos and documents that are quite extensive on this website for the proof, help you prove to others that this building and the other Twin Towers as well did come down by controlled demolition. And then sign our petition. Even if you're not an architect or engineer, you can support them. We have more than 20,000 others sign on to the petition as well. But there's 3,000 architects and engineers who have staked their reputation on calling for a new independent investigation based on the evidence that you've seen today. 3,000 of them on the petition. So sign there and then donate to us. We are a nonprofit organization of 501c3, and your donation is tax deductible according to the laws that exist. And we encourage you to support us. We're all over the country making presentations at conferences around the country, constantly educating the media, the Congress, the public as well, and the academic institutions. We can't do this without your support. So please join us. In fact, become a member of AE911 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters who give monthly. A cup of coffee a month. Can you afford that to keep the truth about 9/11 alive in this time of coronavirus, where it's dominated the news? And we can't lose the opportunity here. The 9/11 truth will not be quarantined. Okay? If you support us and you give. And if you can't do that, you have time that can help us. You're home maybe from work. We encourage you to volunteer. Andy, how can they do that?
Absolutely. And this is a time where you can get a lot of work done if you're quarantined at home or in the lockdown. And we got a lot of stuff. Most of it is done at home when people have time to do this kind of work. And it really goes a long way, even if it's you consider it a small thing, even if you're just looking up somebody's address or making a phone call or forwarding this information to some professor's inbox. We're finding all the ways that we can do it, and we're going to even have some cool congressional outreach coming up pretty soon. The easiest way to volunteer, though, is to go to ae911truth.org, and right there's an online form. It's very short. You fill it out. We'll get in touch with you, see where you best fit, which I usually base off of what the volunteer finds that they best fit, and we'll get you started. And again, that will go a long way, just a few hours work each week. So if you can do it, then please fill out that form.
Thanks, Andy. And guess what? If you guys don't like working with people, you can work by yourself. Just go to the website, get the information, the ae911truth.org link, send it to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know, elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Share the DVDs, share the brochures, which you can get on our website, 100 of them for $10 or something like that. And you can go and share the final report of the World Trade Center 7 study. Just go to WTC7evaluation.org and download the report. Send it to the structural engineers around the country, and take it to your local representative as well. What are the opportunities there, Andy?
Absolutely. This is the Bobby McIlvaine Act. It is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act is the longer title, but it is the path to justice for the nearly 3,000 people. I mean, we've had this petition out there for a long time asking Congress to do its job and reinvestigate the destruction of these 3 towers and actually look seriously at this evidence that Richard's presented today and in other webinars. And then we decided, hey, we're going to do the work for them. We wrote the bill. All it needs is some congressmen to introduce it and for it to be passed, and it would do exactly what I just described. It would be that new investigation we've all been working so hard for. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who tragically lost his life on September 11th. He was killed by an explosion, which doesn't really jive well with the official story. So that's one of the reasons we named it after him. Now, if you want to learn more about it, you can go to ae911truth.org/justice. And it's got the whole write-up on there. You can download a little booklet that has a letter from Richard on there, a letter from Bob, and it has the act itself. You can go hand it to a congressman, or if you're in lockdown and you're not able to talk to your congressman face-to-face, you can certainly call them. Let them know what you think about this issue, and they will make a tally of what you talked about that day. And you can also, if you don't have that kind of time, you can just fill out your name and address. It will generate a letter already written for you, go right to your representatives' inboxes. There's many things that you can do, but they got to hear from you, because as I always say, politicians don't do anything unless they are made to do it through peaceful lobbying and activism. So you got to be a part of that to see this done. So please get behind it.
And get behind this one too. It's the Grand Jury Investigation Project. The U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Jeffrey Berman, agreed in writing to comply with the law, which requires him to submit this evidence, which we gave him in 57 exhibits, now 60, to a special grand jury. We're now suing him to prove that he's done that. So stay tuned about that one. And then tell everybody, once that grand jury investigation gets under wraps, we're expected to be brought in as expert witnesses with the evidence you've seen today. We're also suing the FBI, and that's under appeal now. It's going to a higher court. So we're very excited about the opportunities to force them to release the information that they have, including the World Trade Center documentary we made, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, in which they've said it's backed by thorough research and analysis, and the thermitic materials paper, which their lab fraudulently declared invalid, but they have it, and they were obligated by law to provide that to the Congress in the 2015 review commission that Congress had set up. So that was withheld, and so that's why they're being sued now. And all of this is why we have 5 New York area fire commissioners unanimously voting for a resolution to demand a new investigation based on the evidence you've seen today, and that you'll see next week in part 2 and 3 of this series. So he says, Chief Commissioner Christopher Joya, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. And they're working on that right now. So we have created a documentary which we want you to see. It includes material in this course that you've seen today, but a whole lot more interviews from 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence for you in order. And take just a look, and then I'm going to come back and answer your questions.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Well, yes, you can include this whole documentary is included in this set, along with additional meet the experts. So here's the 1.5 hour version. Now it's free on YouTube, the 1 hour version, but you get so much more if you get the DVD. So encourage you to do that and download the 50-page booklet Beyond Misinformation, which is great information for you, not just for structural engineers and architects, but everybody. It's pretty easy to read, but thorough. Put it on your coffee table. BeyondMisinformation.org. You can download that for free, the PDF version. And the Blueprint for Truth, as I mentioned earlier, is the 2-hour research edition of this presentation, and a 15-minute documentary on Building 7, which was made for PBS. It's narrated by Ed Asner. It's extraordinary. Just 15 minutes, just on World Trade Center 7. Use this to get people interested in the truth about 9/11, those who don't have a lot of time. And that you can watch free on YouTube, or you can get the DVD version. So now let's do the questions, Andy.
All right. First question says, at first, NIST said the visible portion in the videos of Building 7's collapse was clocked at 40% longer time than a free fall time would have taken. They said this in August of 2008 before the final November 2008 report showed the NIST graph with 1/3 of that time to be in free fall time. Do you know if there was a NIST graph in the earlier August report before that final November report came out? It would seem odd to me if they only produced a graph afterwards in hindsight.
It is odd, and they did only produce the graph afterwards in insight. At least I never saw a graph showing. Well, all they did was describe the timeline. You know, they waited until they saw a pixel move, and they started the timeline at that point, and then I forget the amount of time after that is when the building actually fell. So they averaged it out and said, oh, it didn't occur at free fall because they averaged what they called the start of the collapse, which was just a pixel moving on the screen to reduce the amount of acceleration down to 1/3 of free fall, as you say. So no, they wouldn't be graphing that out. Otherwise, they would have had to admit and show graphically that there was free fall. Andy, do you have any other insight on that question?
Oops, sorry, I had trouble getting off mute there. I have no further insight. I think that NIST is just always constantly in damage control when some new piece of evidence or comes out or somebody get called out on something. And so whatever graphs or shiny pictures they can produce to wow you into believing their story, they will do. That's all I have to say on that. The next question says, if thermal expansion can cause one girder to fall off of one column, and then that causes other thermally weakened connections below to also fail, resulting in the entire collapse of Building 7, then would I be correct to assume that a few fires are far more dangerous than a strong, powerful earthquake? Wouldn't a huge earthquake vigorously shake every single connection of an entire building rather than just a few connections weakened by fire? If modern buildings are most likely engineered to survive a powerful earthquake and its many strong aftershocks, then fire being more dangerous than earthquakes to me is very counterintuitive. Any comments?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, NIST needs to answer to this question as they do to many of the other excellent questions from our insightful audience here. These buildings are especially in New York, are designed to resist wind loads, hurricanes. They have more here, and they're also designed to resist earthquakes. And earthquakes don't bring down modern steel frame high rises. They're incredibly ductile. They sway, they move, they flex, and this would make fires much more dangerous in these buildings. And of course, this is what NIST has done, is created a little bit of a panic in the building industry, or tried to, but failed, by making recommendations that of structural engineering improvements in the building codes. But these were never followed by the International Conference of Building Officials in the International Building Code. None of them. No structural enhancements, because they know that their buildings are safe. They've never had a problem. They probably know that this whole report on the part of NIST is a complete fabrication, but I doubt they actually said that publicly.
Our next question says, assuming that NIST is correct in that the videos of Building 7 only show the outside shell falling, how did NIST explain the symmetry we see in those videos of the shell's collapse?
Did NIST have an explanation for the symmetry? No. And their computer model, which they say proves that the building came down similarly to the video, completely disproves it, because it's completely asymmetrical, whereas the actual collapse of the Building 7 overall collapse, the global collapse, we call it, is symmetrical. And in order to produce a symmetrical collapse, the University of Alaska had to, in their 4-year, $300,000 study, they had to remove all 80 columns on at least 8 floors within a fraction of a second of each other, or a second and a third, I think it is, of each other. So that's the only way that it could produce symmetry. So NIST disproves their own theory with their own computer modeling study, which begins to tip over. So they stop that animation just 2 seconds after they started, because it would have tipped over, and it never ever achieved free fall acceleration like we see in the building 7 or the Symmetry.
Okay, final question. It says there was a column of smoke above the collapse of building 7 almost a mile high. Is that a problem for the official story?
Well, there were only a few small scattered fires in here in this building. And compared to other skyscraper fires, which are much more severe and hot, longer lasting. And surely those fires would have been put out by the air pressure of a collapsing building. And yet, after the collapse of this building, there was an incredible smoke column indicating lots and lots of heat, which, as we saw also in the video, was expanding rapidly in all directions after the collapse of this building, with cauliflower-shaped plumes rapidly expanding. A lot more heat required for that type of expansion in this plume above the building than we see in the few small scattered fires before this building. So it's a huge problem for the official story, yeah.
All right, so that is the final question. So for my part, I want to thank everybody, and I will see you next week.
And thanks, Andy, for helping us. What we've seen today, everybody, is part 1 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide, a 3-part series. And next week, we'll get to part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. A week after that, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we examine in much greater detail the source of this heat and the analysis regarding the possible causes of it, as we hinted at today. So come back next Thursday and join us for these remaining sections. And until then, we'll see everybody. Bye for now.